Hello friends, it's Kayla. Today I wanted to do a video like I did last year. Right after posting my favorites of the year, I did a follow-up where I talked about all of my honorable mentions. We're currently on vacation. I'm sorry if you're gonna hear some road noise. The hill just opened, so there's a lot of traffic right outside the window. But since I just posted my favorites of the year and I'm here, I was thinking, how can I do this video without holding up all of the books and bringing them all with me? And I figured a bracket was in order. I read 270 books in 2023, and if I disliked a third of them, liked a third of them, and loved a third of them, I want the opportunity to go through all of the ones I loved just so you know what they all are, especially since so many of these almost made it into that 10th spot of my top 10, but I decided to do 9 instead. Anyway, I'm going to tell you about all of my 4.5 and 5 stars, and then a couple 4s, just because I had to have a certain number of books and seeds to make this bracket work. Let's start with fantasy, sci-fi, horror, and all of that on the left. First up, Lost in the Moment and Found, which is book number 9 in the Wayward Children series. It's a Portal Fantasy novella series that takes us in this book to like an annex where there are a bunch of door options and the girl who spends her time there. It's one of the heavier books of the series, but almost every book has gotten a 5, so that one is no different. And then it's gonna go up against Immortal Longings. This is an Antony and Cleopatra inspired modern day fantasy kind of origin story of the romance between those two. It's mostly focused on like world building and explaining this game where you can body jump between people and you have to kill the other like 87 competitors. I'm gonna have to move on Immortal Longings because it almost made that 10th spot. The next two battling, Kaikeyi and Mammoths at the Gates. So Kaikeyi is about a young girl. She has a banished mother in their kingdom, and it's like her fight for independence as she becomes a mother herself. And then Mammoths at the Gates is another part of a novella series. It's hard to move that one along, no matter how much I love Chi, a cleric who researches and keeps records of stories. This one's about like floods and mammoths and the death of their mentor. I find it hard to move on part of a novella series as much as I love it. A standalone fantasy will just always naturally hit harder for me. The next two we have are Half a Soul and Babel. So Half a Soul, in the moment, I think I was kind of in a drought with loving romance within other genres, and I really needed this story. Does it hold up? I'm not really sure. I would have to reread it, but I remember like the idea of enjoying a fairy book for the first time it sent me to the moon. It's about like a cursed fairy working with this lord to find the other half of her soul. And then Babel, like Half a Soul is gonna move on because Babel only got a 4.5. It was like everything I love, academia, loneliness. There were footnotes. There was a lot of like heavy-handed messaging about colonialism, racism, and I loved that, but I'm a character girl and I needed there to be more convincing dynamics and history between the friendships in this one. Half a Soul convinced me I like fairy books. Adventures of Mina al-Sarafi made me realize I like pirate books, or at least this one. Amina has this past as a powerful, intimidating pirate. She's retired, but someone comes and asks her for a favor, and that sets her off on this adventure of completing these tasks and building the crew again. And it was only a 4, so I can't move it on. Up against Emily Wilde, that doesn't really stand a chance because, oh my god, another fairy book I like. Emily's a professor. She's building this encyclopedia of fairy lore, and she's working with this guy she doesn't like, a fellow professor named Wendell, and they get into all of these shenanigans in the name of research. It was perfect for me. I gave it a 5. It's in my top, was it in my top 3? I think it was in my top 3 of 2023, but we'll see if we can confirm that via this bracket. The next ones are like real world, a little bit of surrealist stuff. So Nothing to See Here is a funny, like found family style book where a woman becomes a caretaker for her two of her friends' children as she tries to keep them calm and loved as they spontaneously combust. And then Una Out of Order is like the one book I read every year about a woman learning to live in the moment and appreciate her life via a series of time travel wackiness. She lives like 1 year of her life at a time, but it's out of order and she has to just exist. It was like an objective 5. Looking back on it, I don't remember a ton about it. I'm not obsessed with it, but it was definitely a 5. I do have to move on Nothing to See Here though, because that is much more memorable. The next two were both actually 4 stars, so this is a real battle. We've got Throne of the Fallen, aka Fairy Book Love of My Life number 3. It's about like a demon forced by an evil fairy to complete tasks to save his demon court, and then he wants to hire this artist for a job, and she's our main character, and he just begins lusting over her, and that really takes over the plot. Pit up against that is The God of Endings, which is this slow historical vampire novel about a woman who's an artist as well, coping with her vampirism and coming to care for a student art prodigy of hers when she becomes a teacher because she becomes concerned for his home life. I'm gonna move on Throne of the Fallen, just because I want to be able to say fairy smut book made it past seed number 1. Terrace Story versus Severance is next. Terrace Story is another like lightly surreal book. It was my final read of the year. It's kind of 4 interwoven short stories with this woman who can create space, make things bigger. It's kind of existential. There was a lot of interaction between various family members. I gave it a 4.5. It wasn't as impactful as Severance, because Severance I gave a 5. It was one of the first 5s I gave of the year. It's about a pandemic in New York City. It had stunning language, kind of a mundane story of these characters traveling to find safety. It's kind of a satire. It's about capitalism and how people do and do not respond to a global pandemic. So that one's gonna move along. Then I have 2 classic books I finally got to, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and The Little Prince. I'm sure you know what these are about. You probably read them far before I ever did, but they're both kind of spacey, which is fun. I loved both of them. I'm glad I finally read them, but I don't think either of them are like life-changing all-time favorites. Maybe if I had read them 15 years ago, but I am gonna move on. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Then we have Chain Gang All-Stars versus Binti. So Chain Gang All-Stars was exactly what it wanted to be. It was talking about prison reform through this dystopian lens, the sick way that the criminal justice system already works, and humanity's lack of empathy, but it took it to an extreme with like this televised deadly competition. I gave it a 4.5, but Binti got a 5, so that one's gonna move on, which is also like exactly the novella it wanted to be. It perfectly accomplished its goals. A novella has to hook your attention right away, but it still had time to like flesh out its characters. Binti's traveling through space to this university. It's kind of action-packed. Even though it's so short, it was a lot about technology and language. I found it really interesting, and I definitely want to continue in the series, so I'm moving that one along. My next pairing is confusing science fantasy reads with like A+ characterization. Gideon the Ninth, the writing style is really what got me. It's about like Gideon who's in servitude, and there's 9 planets, 9 houses. She only has one friend / big enemy, and they work together to ascend to like immortality. That's kind of the loose goal. I love the snark between them. The narration of the book is so fun. I only give it a 4, but I think when I go back to this after reading the whole series, it could get a 5. What did get a 5 is Leech. Leech was equally confusing and strange. The payoff was so great for this one, getting to understand who this nameless, genderless doctor was, why, like where they came from, what they're doing at this chateau, what killed the doctor that came before, like what we're meant to understand by this shared consciousness. The dynamics between all these people at the chateau and understanding the control they have over the land. The intrigue was like an A+. So that one is moving along. Next, we've got Several People Are Typing versus Fina. Several People Are Typing was this quirky little like nothing of a book that was just told via Slack messages. Somebody gets stuck inside Slack, the computer program for workplaces. And then Fina was equally workplace focused, where these 2 characters who used to date get stuck together, kind of time traveling inside their workplace as they're trying to find something. They were both too short to have like a super long lasting impact on my life. But Fina is going to move on because I gave that a 5, where Several People Are Typing was a 4.5. Then we've got Feed Them Silence versus Monstrilio. Feed Them Silence was only a 4. It was a treat to read after this author published Summer Suns, which I gave a 2 and everybody else loved. I didn't know if they would be for me, but then picking up this one made me even more excited to pick up their 2024 release. It's about, it's a novella, and it's about this woman obsessed with understanding wolves, so much so that she like invades their minds. So very sci-fi. The one it's up against, Monstrilio, is more literary horror. And it's about this child who dies at the beginning of the book and his family members grieving, but also the accidental-ish creation of a monster from his body parts, and following them through many years and how they interact with this creature. Monster Leo was a 5. It's kind of an all-time favorite now, so it's obviously moving on. Then we have Vampires del Norte and Don't Fear the Reaper. Both got 4s. So Vampires del Norte, it has a pretty high average rating and it was in the Goodreads Choice Awards, but every time I talk about it, it seems like the majority are very vocal about how they disliked it. I think it was more like historical and romance than the horror people were expecting. The vampires aren't like the main presence you expect them to be, but I just love Nena and Nestor's dynamic over the years and following them. So that one's gonna move on. Don't Fear the Reaper is so good, but again, it's a sequel, which definitely deserves its flowers, but won't make it to like the top 10. Has a sequel ever made it to my top 10 of the year? I don't think so. If you liked My Heart is a Chainsaw and you wanted it to have more action earlier on, this one definitely accomplishes that. It has more consistent horror and it's about the evils that consume this town. Then I have Green Fuse Burning against Natural Beauty. Green Fuse Burning is another artist, main character, who's spending time in a cabin on a swamp to work on her art. She's actively grieving and perhaps hallucinating. It's a really short novella, so I'll just keep it at that. It got a 4.5. And then Natural Beauty, I read twice to solidify it as a favorite. It's definitely a 5, about this woman who gets caught up working for a spa and the weird medical treatments that they do and the weird relationship she starts to have with coworkers and various people. Very unsettling. Have to continue it on. Then The Reformatory versus The Haunting of Alejandra. This is an easy one as well because The Haunting of Alejandra only got a 4, but you're following various family members in this family as they deal with La Llorona. And then The Reformatory is heavy historical horror where there are ghosts at this school and a black boy in the American South and his sister trying to work to get him out of there before he loses his life. The Reformatory was a contender for that number 10 position of my top 10, so it is continuing. Then Chlorine versus Our Share of Night is another easy one. Chlorine got a 5, Our Share of Night was a 4.5. Chlorine is about a young girl on a swim team. She's convinced she's a mermaid and the book gets very weird and there's a lot of uncomfortable relationship dynamics to follow. Our Share of Night is like a culty book. For that to get a 4.5 is kind of a major feat. So there are so many storylines in it. It's not just focused on the cults, but there is this father-son who are the focus, and the father's about to die and there is this immortality group that he's involved in and he's trying to protect everybody. It was very long. It's not as vivid in my mind where Chlorine is, and again, almost made it into the top 10, so that one is continuing. In this quadrant, 4.5 to 5-star fiction, old and new alike, starting with Passing, which is about 2 black women in the 20s and about their decision to pass or not as white women for their social status and safety benefits. It's about their interactions and their decisions. It was fascinating to follow. I gave it a 5. And it's up against And Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer, which if it was just books that make me cry, automatically will make it into my top 10. This would be number 1. I sobbed from page 1. It's a concept about an elderly man trying to hold on to his memories. It was devastating. I'm gonna move on Passing though. Maybe less of an impact emotionally, but more enjoyment as a novel. Then we have How Beautiful We Were against Giovanni's Room, both 5 stars. How Beautiful We Were is about a fictional African village and them responding to an American oil company destroying their land and poisoning them. There are many characters, different views, all coming to similar conclusions, but at different paces. It was really interesting. And then Giovanni's Room is set in Paris about a man deciding like what kind of man he wants to be, what kind of life he wants to live. Does he want to be true to himself or stay safer and closeted? There's a lot of internal homophobia and shame that we're wading through, but How Beautiful We Were is moving on. Next is The Picture of Dorian Gray versus On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. 2 more 5 stars battling. The Picture of Dorian Gray is about Dorian being the inspiration for this art piece and how the art and the person play off of each other. What makes you a good person? It was clever and it had stunning quotes, and I'm so glad I finally read it. And then On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, again, almost made it into that number 10 spot of my top 10. It had the best writing of the year, but the story just didn't stick with me as much as others. It's about this young boy who starts writing letters to his mother about his life, and it goes through many, many years of him exposing everything that's happened to him, a lot of generational trauma. I have to move that one along because just it was stunning. Black Cake versus East of Eden, another modern story versus a classic. Black Cake is about a young girl in the Caribbean escaping under tense circumstances, and then in the present day we're following siblings whose mother recently passed away and left behind this voice recording and everything that they learn and how they connect. East of Eden is a biblical inspired story. It's about these different families, about good and evil, what makes you a good person. We're just following them, a bunch of different relationships, job decisions that they're making. Everyone has like a major flaw, I would say, in the story that you're following, getting to learn about. I gave that a 4.25 technically, so I am gonna move on Black Cake. Then we have Indian Horse and Such a Fun Age. So Indian Horse is about a young boy taken to a residential school. It's about trauma. It's about discovering a love for hockey and finding a way to escape, and the long-lasting mental and physical impact of these residential schools and the horrific things that occur. And then Such a Fun Age is about a Black woman who's babysitting for this white family, and she gets accused of like kidnapping the child, and it's about the reactions of all the people who encounter her and she talks to. But then it's also just her story figuring out what she wants in life and what she cares about. Indian Horse is moving on because it got a 5, where Such a Fun Age got a 4 point something. And then we have a couple thrillers to go through. There's only a few of them. Something in the Water versus The Writing Retreat first. Something in the Water is about this couple on their honeymoon, and the first half of the book there is like no mystery. We're just learning about their dynamics and their history and enjoying their lives. And then they find something in the water, and it's about who they can trust, if they can even trust each other, and what they do with this information, making ridiculous decisions. The Writing Retreat is similarly half the book doesn't really do anything until a mystery gets presented, but there's all these women who arrive at this writing retreat, and the person who's putting it on is strange, and the expectations of them and the novel they have to write gets more and more unhinged. I gave Something in the Water only a 4 point something, so The Writing Retreat is moving on. It was almost my number 10, top 10 of the year. Then we have a book that did make it, Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone versus The Woman in the Library. The first one is about this family reunion and this man telling us this story of all the crimes that have been committed by his family members. And there also is this murder mystery because somebody is found dead at their reunion. The Woman in the Library is about this woman writing a novel, and it's the correspondence between her and her editor, and that it's mostly the story that she's actually telling within the pages, where these 4 people meet at a library and they hear this woman scream, and then they find out she died, and it's them piecing together the puzzle. I wanted the 2 narratives to converge just a little bit more, and it could have gotten a 5, but the first one did, so that is continuing. Then The Other Side of Night versus The Last Word. The Other Side of Night was a 5-star mystery. It's a slow detective-focused novel, but you can tell there's something that you're not being told. It's got a weird, vague kind of writing style, but there is this young boy who loses both of his parents, and the detective, suspended detective, is suspicious of how they died and also wants to keep an eye on the man who's now caring for the young boy. It has one of the most what the fuck endings, and it requires a lot of my brain to understand what was really happening, and it almost made the top 10. And then The Last Word, honestly, like any of my 4-star thrillers could have taken this spot. This is the lowest rated one that I have here. I just needed to throw something in. I have a couple I could have chosen between. This is about a woman who writes a poor book review, and then the author takes it upon himself to challenge that, and at the same time she's being stalked, begins to feel unsafe where she's staying, and she has some past things that we get to learn about. I'm moving on, of course, The Other Side of Night. Then I have a chunk of romance. Now, no romance got a 5, so these are just in here for the obligatory, I needed 64 books to fill this all out, and also, like, I want to take the opportunity to tell you my favorite romance. So we have Happy Place by Emily Henry, which I know is a lot of people's not favorite, but it's technically my favorite Emily Henry, and it's a second chance romance where these 2 fake date because they don't want their friend group to know that they broke up. I thought it was great, and I gave it a 4.25. I liked all the dynamics. It was like sentimental the entire time. I have a hard time when romance books are really fun and rom-com and then devolve into sentimental, moving stuff, but this was melancholy the entire time. Kind of reminded me of 7 Days in June. In this round, it's up against Highly Suspicious and Unfairly Cute, which is a YA romance that I don't remember super well, but I do remember giving it a 4.75 and saying this is the closest to a 5. You can consider this my favorite romance. I read it pretty early in the year. And it's about these two who go on this like survival camping trip together, and they don't totally get along, and then they just have this sweet relationship. I wish I remembered more about it. I have another Emily Henry on here, People Who Meet on Vacation, which is about these friends who go on vacations together every year, and then something went wrong and they haven't been on one in a couple years, and they're getting back together as friends and perhaps more. I also have Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail, which is like, shouldn't be on here, and it's not going to move on, because I remember when I read this, I said in the video, I have to give this a 4.25 even though it feels wrong, because the first book in the series, Delilah Green Doesn't Care, got a 4, and I clearly like this one better. So in this moment, technically I'm just moving both of the ratings down to be in the 3s, because I barely remember anything about this book. There is a woman who's renovating this house, and she falls for somebody who is in the family who doesn't want to sell the place, and then they have to be on this TV show together and they're pretending to date, or they're pretending to hate each other because the dynamics on TV are really good. Either way, Emily Henry is moving on in that category. Then we have The 7-Year Slip versus Love in Color. The 7-Year Slip is a time travel book, and this woman enters an apartment and there's a man there from 7 years ago, and they start up this relationship, but it's also about her current life and in publishing, and it was interesting. I gave it a 4.25, I think. And then Love in Color, I gave a 4.5, so that one's gonna move on. It's a series of short stories by the author of Honey and Spice, which was my favorite romance of last year, and this just gave a lot of like pieces that I felt, feelings that I felt in Honey and Spice, but put them into all of these different short stories of women in history and mythological tales, and I just really loved it. And then my final quadrant is nonfiction. So A Mind Spread Out on the Ground is a memoir about the environment and language and really difficult topics. Hunger is another memoir that's more personal about Roxane Gay's history with eating and body image and society. And the former has more essays about like the world as well as individual situations. So I'm moving on the first one, even though I gave them both a 5. Next, we've got a 4.5 and a 4. So It Came From the Closet is a series of essays from a whole bunch of authors, all talking about a horror movie and how they tie it to the queer experience, theirs or generally. A lot of really interesting ideas in here. Not every single essay is going to land, but this I actually for a moment was considering being in my top 10, because I still think about it so often, and some of these essays are some of my favorites. And then Freedom is a Constant Struggle got a 4, only because every individual essay or interview or speech was a 4.5 or a 5. It talks a lot about racism and slavery and Palestine and prison reform, but as a collected piece, it was quite repetitive, because it's not written as an intentional standalone experience. It is just a collection of speeches. So I'm gonna move on. It Came From the Closet. Then we've got Know My Name versus Little Devil in America. Know My Name is a 5-star memoir, one of my first reads of the year, and still has an impact. I think everybody respects and appreciates this book as Chanel Miller recalls the assault that took place, that she horrifically experienced, and the lawsuit that came after, and just so much about rape culture that was really valuable. And then A Little Devil in America is about Black performance artists and pieces of work, and the struggle, the perseverance, incredibly well done essays. These two shouldn't have been pitted against each other this early, because they're two of the best written nonfictions that I have on here, but I'm moving on. A Little Devil in America. Then we have People Change and Advocating for Palestine in Canada, two very different experiences. One is about, it's very short, it's very simple, just a really good conclusive idea of change within people. It's a lot about the trans identity, but also just about human beings and our desire and need and accepting never staying the same. And then Advocating for Palestine in Canada is a research-based book just about the history of certain movements in Canada fighting for the freedom of Palestine. I'm gonna move that one along because it was more valuable to me. Then we have How to Save Babylon versus The Black Eye Dies at the End. Again, two very different types of nonfiction. One is a memoir about this woman and her upbringing in Jamaica and her Rastafarian father, and just the way that she has decided to live her life and the way that he wanted her to live her life. And then The Black Guy Dies at the End is this piece of media critique about how Black characters have been featured in media throughout the years, mostly in horror movies, and the different stereotypes and expectations on actors and characters. I'm moving on the memoir, even though they were both a 5. And now we need to go all the way back up to the top and do our next round. Immortal Longings versus Kaikeyi is tough because they were both so good, but Immortal Longings, like, I want to continue in the series. I feel really invested. A lot of people do not like this book, and when I was considering including it in the top 10, when I was writing a little review up for it, a lot of it was defensive, and I was thinking about all the people who don't love it and how I want it to find its audience. I did reread it. I loved it just the same, but I do think that it was impacted by my tandem read of Antony and Cleopatra at the same time and making the connections between the two. I am moving it on, though it's gonna get kicked out in the next round, I'm sure. Half a Soul versus Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, 2 fairy books up against each other. Emily Wilde has to continue. I enjoyed the romance more, though you might say it's less overtly romantic. Next, we have another fairy book, but it's up against Nothing to See Here, and Nothing to See Here is going to continue. Severance versus Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Oh, this one is tough, but I'm gonna move on Severance because it was one that I was considering as a favorite just because I love the slice of life simplicity of it all. Binti versus Leech. Leech has to move on, though once I complete the Binti series, I might rethink it all. Fina versus Monstrilio. Monstrilio obviously has to move on. Vampires of El Norte now versus Natural Beauty. Obviously Natural Beauty is moving on, but Vampires of El Norte, like, I want you to understand how close to a 5 it actually is. And then The Reformatory versus Chlorine. Both of those, like, these were the 2 that were really battling at the end. The Reformatory no doubt has more mass appeal. Not that that is impacting anything that I'm choosing here. Just wanted to note, I would probably recommend that more broadly than Chlorine. It is Tananarive Dew's best written, in my opinion, so I'm gonna move it on. Then going back to the right side, Passing against How Beautiful We Were. Passing is so good, and in its moment, it was so good. An objective 5-star, but How Beautiful We Were has such a lasting impact on me that that one is continuing. Black Cake versus On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Ocean Vuong is moving on just because of the writing. Then we have an unfortunate, like, fiction versus thriller now because of how it's organized, and The Writing Retreat didn't make my top 10 for a reason. Definitely has far more haters than Indian Horse. I would recommend Indian Horse to so many people, but The Writing Retreat, for me, the ridiculous overtopness of it all definitely is moving it on. The next 2, such 5 stars, but obviously one of them did make it into my top 9. Next is romance. Never did I think, if you told me last year that Talia Hibbert was about to beat an Emily Henry, I wouldn't have believed you, but it is. We've got a romance versus a nonfiction, and it happens to be my second favorite nonfiction of the whole year, so I am moving on A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, though definitely recommend Love and Color. We have my favorite nonfiction of the year versus It Came from the Closet, so A Little Devil in America has to move on. And finally, for this part, we've got Advocating for Palestine versus How to Say Babylon. How to Say Babylon is just one of the best written memoirs that I've experienced. So seeing these 3 nonfictions all stacked up here just feels correct. They're pretty on par with each other. And now for this bracket, I guess this is what you would consider my top 16 of 2023. So Immortal Longings versus Emily Wilde. Immortal Longings is finally getting kicked out, though it hurts me. Nothing to See Here is going to beat out Severance. Leech and Monstrilio are pretty perfectly paired, but I have to move on Monstrilio because it's an all-time favorite, where Leech isn't making it into my, like, top 20 books of all time, where Monstrilio I could maybe see there. And then Natural Beauty versus The Reformatory. Natural Beauty edges it out, but just barely. Back to the right side, How Beautiful We Were and On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Absolutely top 16 worthy, but I'm moving on How Beautiful We Were. The Writing Retreat versus Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone. I'm moving on that one, but just barely. Highly Suspicious and Unfairly Cute, again, we ended up with a romance versus a nonfiction, and a Mind Spread on the Ground. Obviously, considering none of the romance got 5 stars, only makes sense. And then these 2 nonfictions, my favorite one has to move on. And now we're at my top 8 of the year. Emily Wilde versus Nothing to See Here. It's Emily Wilde all the way. Nothing to See Here is so fun, but Emily Wilde is romantic, it's sweet, it's interesting, it's smart, and it obviously has to continue. Monstrilio now versus Natural Beauty. Monstrilio is winning, but barely. And now we know my favorite fiction book of the year, How Beautiful We Were, and my favorite thriller of the year, Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone. And if I had to choose between those 2, I think it has to be the mystery thriller. And just as it should be, the 2 nonfiction up against each other are the 2 that did make it onto my favorites, but A Little Devil in America has moved on. And these are my 4 favorite books of the year. Emily Wilde now versus Monstrilio. Monstrilio is taking it. Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone, A Little Devil in America. A Little Devil in America is continuing. And my favorite book of the year, it feels weird to call a nonfiction my favorite book of the year, because like if I was making a list for you of my top 20 books of all time, I don't think a nonfiction would end up in there, because I appreciate nonfiction in a different way than I love fiction. So either one of these feels fine calling my favorite book of the year. I am gonna throw the nonfiction in there, because then I don't have to technically choose an all-time favorite fiction of the year. Like, I know it's here, but because I put a nonfiction in that top spot, it's like I feel like I don't have to choose between all of the speculative things on the list. At least that's what I did when I chose my top 9. So now you know my favorite book of the year, my top 16 of the year, and my top 64 of the year, in case anybody ever wanted to know. They could come here and learn all of that. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you tomorrow with something else. I can't remember, maybe it's like a goals video. We're here for a few more days and then I'll head home and do that. This timing I think all makes sense for my video schedule, but I will see you soon. Love you as a friend, bye.